Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's program on the topic of corporate sustainability, creating long-term value through ESG practices. I'm Kai from Nasdaq and I will be serving as the moderator for today's event. Before we start today's session, we'd like to spare 2 minutes for the participants who may be still streaming in, so do feel free to use this time to grab some refreshments, etc. before we proceed with the main agenda for today. Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's program on the topic of corporate sustainability, creating long-term value through ESG practices. This program is being presented by James Beasley of Nasdaq and Dr. Ashraf Gamal El Din of Hawkamah. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I'd like to let the audience know that you are able to ask questions during the program by utilizing the Q&A function in your Zoom screen. Questions from the audience will be answered by our speakers as time allows. Without further delay, let me introduce our speakers for today. First, we have James Beasley from Nasdaq. James is the Senior Director of Governance and Compliance Advisory in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa regions at Nasdaq. Based in London, James is a governance and board effectiveness specialist with over 13 years of experience working with some of the world's largest and most complex organizations. James joined Nasdaq from Deloitte, where he spent 8 years in governance advisory, latterly as a director leading on board effectiveness and wider governance transformation activities. Throughout that time, he supported boards through reviewing effectiveness and performance, as well as designing and implementing appropriate actions to take boards forward on their effectiveness journeys. Joining James today is Dr. Ashraf Gamal El Din. Dr. Ashraf is the Chief Executive Officer of Hawkamah, the Institute of Corporate Governance, and is a fellow and certified governance expert from the Chartered Governance Institute in the UK. Prior to his experience with Hawkamah, he has been serving in numerous positions such as Executive Chairman of Egypt Post, Deputy Executive Director of the Egyptian Banking Institute, and many more. Dr. Ashraf has also served as an advisor to the Minister of Investment between 2004 to 2010 in the areas of corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, privatization, as well as restructuring. Without further ado, I'll hand the time over to James as well as Dr. Ashraf to address today's topic. James and Dr. Ashraf, please.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and welcome everyone on this webinar. If I can just give you a very quick sort of overview of why we thought of this webinar. Of course, we are very delighted at Hawkamah to team up with Nasdaq on various events this year. And one of these events actually is that we have wrote together a report, and that report is about the COVID-19 and ESG investing. Inshallah, the report will be ready next week, and once the report is ready, you'll receive an email from Nasdaq with the link to the report where you can download the report and enjoy reading it. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback on the report and suggestions for other reports in the future. So the idea of the webinar today is we discuss this concept of ESG investing and sustainability. The report will focus actually on 3 key areas. Number one, the report examines what are the latest trends, global trends in the area of ESG investing, what's happening, especially since the pandemic. There are massive changes that took place, and we'll discuss that in today's webinar. And then we will start to talk, in the report, it's about the MENA region as well. So how will position companies of the MENA region to benefit from ESG investing and to be able to attract serious investors to invest in the region. And then finally, we talk about the role of the boards of directors in the region and globally in the area of ESG investing, and what is it that boards can do so that they can put their companies in a position to be able to attract ESG investing into their companies. Now, of course, I'm very delighted that I have James Beasley with me on this session. He is one of the leading experts in Nasdaq, and he has massive experience in this. So welcome, James.
Thanks, Dr. Ashraf.
Now, if I may start, James, by just asking a question on what does this ESG mean? Because again, we hear lots of terminologies in that sphere, and it might mean different things. If you can just put things into perspective, when we talk about ESG, what do we talk about exactly? James.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ashraf, and morning, everyone, by the way, or afternoon, actually, indeed, for many of you. Yeah, so I think this is a really important opening question, isn't it? Because I think ESG has very quickly over the last, particularly the last 12, 24 months, become something of a buzzword. I think everybody's heard the terms, but actually, talking about what it means in practicality is something that hasn't necessarily filtered through yet. I think in essence, ESG is a way of operationalizing corporate sustainability, which is another buzzword in itself. And corporate sustainability is a focus on generating long-term stakeholder value. So looking at how organizations can continue to prosper, but in the interest and to the benefit of various stakeholders. So we use the term stakeholder there rather than shareholder, which is perhaps something of a progression from maybe traditional capitalist views, if you like, in terms of generating pure shareholder value. Organizations are increasingly expected to frame strategy, their business plans, their risk appetite, their culture through a lens of stakeholder interests. And those stakeholders, understanding who they are, is critical then to actually operationalizing corporate sustainability. And that's seen through a lens of ESG. So companies still want to deliver value for shareholders. That's central to any capitalist system. But it is increasingly expected that they do so in a way that should serve other stakeholder groups, such as customers, employees, regulators, suppliers, or societies as a whole. So, we use ESG as a way to frame those goals, to measure and to demonstrate how companies will deliver that sustainable value creation. So the E, as we're probably all familiar, stands for environmental, and that measures the firm's environmental impact. The S is for social, which is measuring the impact on society. And those kind of wider groups that might include stakeholders such as customers, for example, and employees. And the G is for governance, and that measures how the organization is run. So ensuring shareholder rights are protected and responsibilities and accountabilities are appropriately recorded. But what ESG means when we bring it together in this framework, I guess you could call it, is that these 3 things are now indelibly linked. So they bind considerations of critical matters like climate change with social mobility and company leadership through due care, skill, and diligence.
So I think in that respect, one of the important factors is number one, we cannot say that ESG is different from sustainability. It's as you said, it's actually how to operationalize that into the company strategy and culture, as you mentioned. But also it's quite important to remember that ESG is actually not one thing. So because people say ESG as if it is only one thing, but as you mentioned, it's actually about environment, and there is lots of things in that under the E. And then you have the social, and there are many things under that. And then you have the governance, and there are many things under this. So it's not really like one thing. It's actually, it has the different elements and different aspects of it, if you like, end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And as we look at through our report, for example, as people will see, you can look at the various different measures of breaking these simple letters down, if you like, to things that are appropriate for individual organizations. But an important takeaway for me, and I'll probably come back to it a few times during this session, is not to think of ESG necessarily as this distinct, discrete thing. Really, where ESG is powerful is when you use it as a framework to think through everything you do in everyday business, when you're considering what those impacts are of the decisions that you're taking or the strategy that you have. And that's always going to be specific to the individual organization. That's going to be, a tailored thing. It's not a one size fits all, but this at least provides that wrapper as a way of thinking these things through and asking the pertinent questions.
Yeah.
So I was struck, actually, I was wondering, Dr. Ashraf, why is ESG important for Hawkamah and for Nasdaq? So we've kind of written this paper together. And I wondered if you had some thoughts to share.
Well, actually, yeah. Okay, Hawkamah, it's originally a governance institute, which is part of the DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Center. When it was created in 2006, the whole idea was to have some sort of a think tank or some sort of knowledge of governance and trying to get the best practices from advanced and developed markets such as the UK and other markets, and then try to see how do they fit in the region itself. And we have been advising lots of boards in the last few years on how to move forward in governance. And then, as you mentioned, this buzzword started to come out, which is ESG and sustainability and so on. And so we started to mention this when we go to boards of directors is governance is one element which is very important, but then you have to think also about other elements. As you mentioned, actually about the stakeholders. So it is not only about maximizing the value for your shareholders, but it's really about the society. It's about all your stakeholders, whether these are shareholders, employees, customers, clients, partners, even competitors. So it is not really about just governance with having the right board of directors and transparency and disclosure. It is really much bigger than this. So that's when we started to add that element. And I really need to mention, because this I think will come across today a lot in that session, is since 2011, Hawkamah and Standard & Poor's have launched together an ESG index for listed companies in the MENA region. So we do cover all the big markets in the region, and we have been reading lots of reports about ESG in the last 10, 11 years. And we have seen the changes which are happening, which I think we'll mention along the day today. So we feel that creating more awareness of the subject is quite important. It's still, I would say, yes, things are changing, but we are very, still left behind if you compare us to other regions. And that's why I think the topic is extremely important for us and for companies in the region.
Yeah,
now, why
I think that's
important why it's important for Nasdaq? That's something that you can tell us, please.
Well, I think that's some really important context that you've just shared there as well, which is that different parts of the world are in different places on this, and it has received different levels of priority, I think, over recent years. But we seem to have a bit of a step change, I think, particularly coming through COVID, for example. And there's something of a generational shift where there's a greater expectation around these things. And the stats in terms of investors' perspectives, or an average person on the streets perspective shifts, I guess, but different to different countries and different regions. But nonetheless, the debate is happening, and we're seeing it reflected in investment, which is really important. I think for Nasdaq, ESG and corporate sustainability, if we put those things together, they're critical elements of true stakeholder capitalist systems. So growing economies whilst maintaining a truly responsible and value-adding business or businesses. So as a concept, ESG is at the forefront of that important drive to sustainability, and it's an important tool for helping companies to understand, to communicate, and to deliver against those various stakeholder interests. So I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier on, but understanding who those stakeholders are for an organization and what their interests might be, that's that important first step. It seems like an obvious thing, but we don't, as organizations, necessarily start off with every decision we make and say, okay, who could this impact? Who might it be in the interest of, and what might their different perspectives be? So we kind of need to have that grounding where we start off with that view, and then you can kind of wrap things around. You know, that brings that understanding also brings clarity as to why we talk about ESG at all. So, you know, as it becomes clear, I think through our paper, it's those stakeholders who are driving debate and communicating those expectations. So, you know, ESG is important for Nasdaq because this debate is happening, whether it's institutional shareholders, governments, think tanks, customer groups. They're all making it increasingly clear what expectations are in the areas around sustainability in terms of impact on the environment, in terms of impact on society, and reflecting changes to different societies. You know, they're driving the debate, they're communicating those expectations. And, you know, for companies, meeting those expectations or not could mean the difference between having access to capital or being given licenses to operate or not. You know, as we see ESG climbing more and more into the public consciousness and into investors' consciousness, you know, it will affect capital flows. But it isn't all stick and no carrot, if you know, to use that phrase. I think ESG assessments and reporting are a means to attract investment, to attract customers, to attract the brightest talent to organizations, and ultimately to deliver that success and sustainable growth. So it feels, you know, coming back to the original question, why is it important to Nasdaq? It feels as if we have a real opportunity right now, perhaps as never before in living memory, if you like, for alignment between business goals and the greater good, which very much aligns to Nasdaq's perspective on how the market should operate.
Well, I think also one of the interesting, dimensions to add to this is, if you talked about this subject like maybe a few years ago about attracting investments and stuff like that, most of the countries in the region wouldn't really care about this, especially talk about, GCC countries where they depended on their own money, if you like, government and as well as families. You know, in the region here, we have some of the biggest sovereign wealth funds, globally speaking. So previously, the whole idea was that we don't really need to get money from anywhere else. But now we have many really quite big IPOs planned by many governments of the region. And some of these biggest sort of blue chips, if you like, are going to be in the stock market very soon. And the market does not really have the liquidity to be able to absorb all these sort of investments, if you like. And that's why many of these, companies which are potentially going for IPOs, they are, contacting us and others to start to say, how can we attract foreign investors? How can we get really, some of these big funds to come to the region and buy our shares and so on? So the key thing is, as you mentioned, is really trying to position the company in the right position so that you think of stakeholders, and in this case, your own investors are those who are potential investors, and how can you make yourself attractive to them? It's really as simple as this. So that dimension was not really there a few years back, but now it is. Again, you talk about billions and billions of dollars of IPOs, which will be offered in the coming couple of years. And there is no way that the region can absorb all these sort of IPOs. The only way to do it is really to get these investors to come to the region. So that's again what adds to the interesting part of this, and the demand for ESG and sustainability, and understanding what can we do, what is really expected from us in these areas. Yeah.
And the next question I was going to ask Dr. Ashraf is, why collectively did we decide to put our paper out that you introduced at the beginning? Why now? And I think you've started to allude to the answer there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things is it's really win-win, because again, of course, Nasdaq has this massive global experience on the ESG investing, sustainability, and so on, and we are a key player here in the region on that file. And we don't really want to reinvent the wheel. We would like to see, how did other countries do that? How are boards acting in the area of ESG? How are boards identifying their own stakeholders? How are companies trying to be attractive for investors? What is the role of institutional investors in these companies? How are they affecting or influencing decision-making in these companies? And we are trying to grasp that knowledge. So I think for us to have that report together, it's really getting this global perspective and then the regional perspective and putting it together, and then get the lessons learned. So the best thing about the report is the final part, where what is the role of the boards here? What can companies do? So it's really very action-oriented. So yes, we draw from experiences, but then we say, if you'd like to be successful, then here is a roadmap for you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's quite essential there.
Yeah, agreed. I think certainly from our point of view, 2020, 2021, they were watershed years in reality internationally around this. And although, of course, the drivers have been a long time coming, we've seen things in the UK and Europe, for example, going back. Well, I mean, going back to when the concept was first created, say, 10 or so years ago, or when that tag was first started to be used, if you like, but, roadmaps were being set out in 2016, 2018 by the EU in a really broad way. But 2020, 21 is where a lot of this seems to have entered into the public consciousness internationally. And so, the disruption caused by COVID highlighted the importance of building sustainable and resilient business models, and particularly around, it's easy to frame those around ESG considerations. So, aside from the challenges, the universal challenges that COVID itself brought, the pandemic, our uncertain in many parts of the world and unbalanced recovery from, has shone a real bright light on the importance of ESG matters, such as things such as company culture, CSR activities, workplace well-being, and other working practices, the stark fragility of supply chains, as many of us are seeing now, and inequality across societies with people impacted in different ways. And there isn't really anywhere in the world that hasn't been impacted. So, from our point of view, I think, we wanted to write this paper together, which highlights with some useful facts and insights, why this is important in the region, and what it might mean for this community, and to increase that local lens with that international perspective, as you mentioned.
Now, you mentioned something which is, I think it's very interesting, and I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this. Because when you mentioned CSR here in the MENA region, it is all about philanthropy. So when we say CSR, it means, some companies are putting some donations for good causes and orphanages and research and stuff like that. Now, does this really fit in sustainability as well? Is this really part of the equation for sustainable business, or that's a different issue completely?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So, at least in my own perspective, CSR is almost a forerunner of a lot of the things that organizations are doing when they talk about ESG. So, when before ESG became the correct term or the widely used term, a lot of organizations, when they were looking at disclosing what they do around CSR, and in my own experiences, what my employers have been communicating to staff and outside the organization around what they do with CSR, a lot of those things are touching on effectively what we talk about with ESG. So it's thinking about considering impact on the environment. It was considering water usage. It was changing from having disposable cups in the canteen or in the coffee rooms to having permanent mugs, or making sure that recycling is the top of the agenda, using tap water rather than bottled water, for example. All of these kind of interesting things which were clearly in the consciousness, but are now very much able to be brought under an ESG strategy. And I think that's a really important thing to be able to say, that a lot of organizations actually have so much to build on in this area. We're talking about ESG as if it's a completely new thing. A lot of these, the ways of thinking, the governance tools that are at our disposal, they're all there really to be built upon and framed in a way that's understandable to our regulators, to our shareholders, to the communities we serve as organizations, to our employees. And that's really where we're heading next.
Now, the first part of the report, I mean, if you go back to the report itself, actually it talks about ESG investment. So the focus there is really about ESG investment. And it's a very interesting part. In your own point of view, what are the key takeaways for the readers? I mean, what do you expect people, when you read that section, to come up with? What are the takeaways for them, please?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we've called it out in the paper is that ESG investing has grown rapidly in recent years. And we can say, at least when we look, perhaps with a US and European lens particularly, we can say that a comfortable majority now view ESG metrics as a key element in considering investment risk. So we're seeing that coming together, if you like, of considering financial risks and considering ESG, which is really important. And increasingly, organizations are looking at firms to be as clear on their ESG risks as they are alongside those traditional financial performance metrics and related risks as well. So we're really seeing a kind of a coming together there. So we've seen a transition from a niche consideration to a mainstream focus. And ESG matters are seen to have a direct impact on the future value and financial performance of an organization. We call out in the paper, actually, that the United Nations developed its Principles for Responsible Investment, PRIs, which advocate for a greater focus on ESG issues investing. They're kind of 5 principles focused on incorporating ESG into investment analysis and decision-making, ownership and stewardship policies, practices and appropriate disclosures, and making a commitment to promoting and cooperating on and reporting on the principles. And we see that where there are lots of, and we can kind of come on to it, where there's lots of other frameworks and reference points and guidelines, et cetera, around ESG internationally, lots of initiatives internationally. We see it often coming back to these points, making the focus being on disclosure and transparency and clear communication in terms of organizations being able to show how they think about these things. So, 100 trillion, I think by our reckoning, $100 trillion worth of assets under management are managed by investors that have signed up to PRIs. But at the same time, they're just the UN PRIs, that is. But at the same time, they're just one measure. They're one framework among a wave of initiatives. We have in the EU, the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, which is focused on disclosures and really shows that the EU wants to be a standard setter in this area. And that's very much embedding into, the operations of asset management firms. So ESG investment, I think, is very much here to stay, will become more and more embedded in the thinking of institutional and retail investments, and therefore the companies in which they have a stake. I think where organizations are trying to attract capital, they will have to be demonstrating that they can think about ESG because their investors are. So they need to be embedding those things. If we think about practical terms, why is this important? Why is ESG investment important? They need to think about, embedding ESG into how the company defines its strategy, how it measures its performance, how it understands risks, how its leadership is rewarded. And if they don't, their stakeholders, their shareholders will, which I think is the important takeaway there.
I think one of the important things that happened during the pandemic is simply maybe it made people reflect and companies reflect upon what they are doing and reassess all decisions that they are making, especially on the investor side. So that's why, for example, in the report, you see some numbers which are very interesting numbers. For example, you see that the inflows into ESG funds actually quadrupled in 2020. So that's in 1 year. So again, because people realize it's not only about money, there are actually other things which you have to pay attention to. So investors start to be more aware of, as you mentioned, the risks of lack of ESG or poor ESG, for example. So that's again, that's really very interesting. Again, another number which was very important is the inflows into European sustainable funds, almost 5 times higher in 2020 than 3 years before. So again, these numbers are very promising numbers, and you cannot just ignore them. That's where the boat is going. That's the trend. So that's really where you have to be looking at as not only as an investor, but as a company as well. That's where the trend is. And if you ignore that, you are doomed, because you'll be left over. You are just being left out of all this sort of improvement, which is really happening. So that rise of ESG investing, it's a very good sign that really you have to pay attention to all these things. So for the first time, we had even social elements coming into the forefront. We never thought of employees and their health and well-being as number one priority for us. But that's happened for 2 years. So for 2 years, government policies, corporate policies, investment policies, it's about people's lives and welfare. How to protect these people from disease and its consequences. How to make sure that they are safe and that they are able to perform properly. And one of the interesting figures which actually are there is even when you look at employees, you think that in times of crisis, employees will stick to their jobs because, if you lose your job, you will not find any other place. But then the amount of resignations happened in a country like the US was massive. Because again, people start to think, we don't like the values of this company, not like the culture of this company. You know what? We are out of here. So again, that's a mind-blowing sort of thing, which means that you need to assess your decisions and strategy in a very different way. Now, previously, you never thought about these things, but now you have to think about all that stuff. So suddenly, things are changing on a really considerable way. And this has to affect the way you think about your own business and your own company and how to make money, and how to deal with your stakeholders. It has to be a game changer for all of us forever. That's not going to go back to, before COVID situation.
And it's a really interesting point, that particularly around the social elements and thinking about staff, effectively voting with their feet, particularly in the governance side of ESG. We've seen, and thinking about the board's leadership and executive leadership of ESG matters and just improving governance in general, we've seen some of these considerations, particularly over the last couple of years, really open up some interesting interesting developments, some interesting agile ways of thinking about what good governance could look like and how you get that the stakeholder voice, onto or into the boardroom. So, we see things such as, for wholesale companies, significant clients presenting to the boardroom. We see things such as panels of staff members, the best and brightest from throughout the organization, having an opportunity to debate matters that are being considered at the board in a panel form or in a kind of just a kind of a committee light form, if you like, to make sure that perspective is heard. We see things like non-executive directors being champions for certain topics, whether they be environmental points, for example, climate-related issues, climate-related risks, or whether it's looking specifically at stakeholder groups. So asking the question about how the customer is impacted when decisions are made, or how staff members are impacted. And, going through processes such as representing the voice of the customer by understanding the customer experience, for example, in the boardroom. So looking at a journey for a typical customer and where the pain points may be, and for them in onboarding and ongoing success. So we really seem to have had the synapses kind of firing off, I think, over the last few years, not only in making sure that under ESG, we can say that governance house is in order, if you like, we are a well-run organization, and we also govern how we think about ESG, but actually thinking in quite an agile and forward-looking way to extract the most value out of the way the organization operates, so that communication to the stakeholders through disclosures around ESG is as rich as it possibly can be, with as much insight, etc., that can be gleaned. And that's going to be the difference, I think, going forwards between those who almost look at ESG as a compliance tick box, which I would argue could be quite high risk, and others who just say, actually, no, we need to embed this in our way of thinking. And, okay, it's going to mean something specific to us versus the company next door. But nonetheless, we understand that, and we're going to take that forward and see how that aligns to our strategy.
Now, based on your own interaction with the companies in say, the UK and other markets, I'm talking about the developed markets now, are companies responding in the same way to that sort of ESG trend, if you like? Do you feel that they are all mature at the same level and they are doing the right thing, or you still think that there are things that they need to be aware of or to do differently, if you like?
Yeah, I think we are seeing different paces, if you like, within the business communities. Inevitably, certain industries and certain countries are probably thinking about this a little bit more. So heavily regulated industries, for example, such as financial services, are inevitably kind of taking the lead on a lot of this because they have regulators who are thinking about this. So, for example, in the UK, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the conduct regulator in financial services, published its ESG strategy, which looked at 5 core themes, which won't seem out of line with as when we've talked about the UN PLIs, for example, where they want to look at transparency, promoting transparency on climate change and wider sustainability, want to look at trust, and building integrity by having labeling of products that are very clear and easy to understand for investors, for example, and for customers, using different tools and supporting across the industry, et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of different themes that are being picked up on. Actually, for the FCA, they all began with T. I don't know why. But the FCA, you know, and other regulators are saying, well, here's a framework we expect you to be adhering to. Now go and apply that and interpret it, et cetera. I think the EU, you know, separately, is clearly, as I mentioned earlier on, you know, they want to become the standard setter. SFDR that I mentioned earlier on is, you know, part of a wider action plan that was announced a few years ago, which was, you know, aimed at encouraging sustainable investing and bringing ESG issues, you know, on par with as I mentioned earlier on, you know, financial performance and financial risks. So, you know, there's probably some obvious leaders. It's not a level playing field. I think the other obvious area would be, you know, the largest institutions, particularly across Europe, you know, with diverse shareholder groups and stakeholder groups. They're going to be under more pressure than others. But hopefully what we'll have, as we often do with these things, I think, you know, with any new initiative, with any new good practice, is a trickle-down effect. So hopefully we'll see that the lessons being learned by, say, financial institutions, where they're effectively being told much more, they're able to be pushed much more to think about this, or the largest organizations where they're coming under the biggest pressure from institutional investors, for example, they will be able to do the lesson learning that can then be adapted for, you know, for other organizations.
I mean, when we talk about this here in the region, I think, as I said, because we have doing lots of research on ESG for the listed companies because of the index we have with S&P, so we do realize that while companies are sort of doing well in governance as compared to other markets, not the same for the ENS. It is really quite seldom that you see a company which is doing proper reporting on the environmental issues and social issues. It is quite rare that you have, for example, numbers about gender diversity on the companies themselves and the employees and staff. It's quite rare that you see, you know, any mention of the carbon footprint of companies. So it is really, you feel that the region is we are still far away in that. And maybe one of the key things is here governance has been driven mostly by regulators. So countries which are having more strict governance regulations, you see companies there are responding by adhering to this because they are worried about the compliance issues. But still the ENS are mentioned very vaguely in some of the regulators. So sometimes they mention, well, companies need to report on sustainability, for example. But that doesn't really have any details. So my point is, now when you think about different frameworks that you mentioned, some of them, like, you know, you have the GRI, for example, you have the TCFD, you have the SASB. Are they different? Should we recommend some of them to companies to say you should focus on this? Or what do you feel about reporting for ESG?
In terms of the different frameworks,
yes,
being used, yeah, I think that I think this is an important bit of context for me. You know, the wide range of standards and approaches that are currently on offer. So, you know, we've mentioned SFDR, we've mentioned the PRIs, you've mentioned, you know, specific regulations that might be in place in different countries, you know, and different regions. You know, we also have, by the way, different rating agencies for ESG matters. So, you know, you have principally MSCI, Sustainalytics, and the ISS, who bring their own overlapping, but, you know, different approaches, I think, to rating how organizations perform on ESG metrics and their overall commitment to sustainability. So I wouldn't necessarily want to trumpet one over another in terms of framework, but I think that companies will undoubtedly benefit from increased consensus on what constitutes a sustainable company or corporation, and perhaps a convergence around certain standards and frameworks. So I think, you know, that's why that trickle-down approach for me is going to be important, and why also principles-based regulation and frameworks also work so well, because it puts the obligation onto the individual companies to figure out what the best standard might be, and then they can learn from each other I think it's important that these things are, I went back to it earlier on, there is carrot, it's not all stick. It's not just about you must comply and do this. It is, let's actually together, let's understand the benefit of why we're saying that we should do this, or why we're asking you to. So, although it's challenging, there's no time to waste. I think organizations will choose, a preferred framework or otherwise, and they will look at increasing numbers of disclosures as examples that perhaps they can follow or pick and choose from and align to. But it's really for the good of the broader stakeholders, for societies, for individual organizations. And there are these proven measures, I think, that we've already referenced, which should be used as a platform to build that sustainable organization.
One of the reasons actually also why, again, we go back to the first question, which is why that's important for us in Hawkamah. In addition to attracting investments, one of the key elements here for lots of companies, especially family-owned businesses and smaller sort of size companies, is they would like to be part of the global supply chain, if you like. So they would like to be connected to large companies in the US or Europe and so on, and be part of that. And one of the things we are telling them is, now these big companies, now they have a massive sort of area of concern, which is reputation risk. So they will not be willing to deal with a company in the region and then find out that this company has lots of pollution in the environment, or they actually mistreat the employees, or have discriminatory sort of practices among different types of religions and gender and stuff like that. So we're telling companies that even if you don't need to attract funds and investments, if you'd like to be part of that global supply chain, you really have to have that level, because it's about risk. So again, talk about ESG risks as well is I think quite important and essential for companies to consider. Even if you don't need money, but you'd like to do business with the West or the advanced markets, you have to pay attention to these things, child labor, discrimination, pollution, and all that stuff. Otherwise, you'll not be able to do that. Yeah. Now, I think let's focus on the last part of the discussion, if you like, on the implications for boards of directors. Now, what can boards do there? I mean, where do you start in that respect? Yeah,
and I think in our paper, we've called out some key questions to ask boards and leadership, and to think about how to help the organization and the individual directors from their on the journey. I would call back to, just as a bit of context, that a lot of those, as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of the tools that can be so helpful in demonstrating an organization what it thinks about ESG and what it does about ESG and how it measures itself, etc., they already exist within government. So when you set your strategy, when you look at and monitor your risk appetite, when you define your culture and your purpose and your values as an organization, when you define your pay structures, how people are rewarded and motivated and remunerated, and that might be non-pay structures as well in terms of other incentives that you might give, such as we do things like charity days, for example, as you said, under CSR earlier on. When you look at talent management practices and succession planning, and your internal and your external reporting, as organizations, as boards, you can look at each of those key things, those key tools that you use, and think, okay, how do we embed what we think about ESG in this, or ESG considerations into all of those things? So, it has to be a priority for Middle East and North Africa boards and management, because it's increasingly a priority in the wider workforce and other stakeholders, including, as you said, international capital, who are looking at things often, as you said, primarily from a risk point of view, from an investment risk point of view, reputational damage and investment risk. The tone from the top is key, I would say. The board, there needs to be clear ownership of this, and the board needs to be clear in how it will oversee ESG matters within the organization, whether that is explicitly having ESG as an agenda item in the shorter term, but hopefully longer term, just embedding it in the way you think about the organization in the same way you think about financial performance. But one thing I would say, for organizations really to live and breathe ESG and make sure that they are able to communicate this as clearly as possible to investors and other stakeholders, don't forget about the tune from the middle. because I think to embed sustainability in the organization, people do need to live and breathe. They do need to understand exactly what this means. So it really needs to be in all of the communication, in the way the organization thinks about itself. You know, what do we mean by ESG, and what are the different times that we bring in those different elements, and get the middle management and everybody else to go along on that journey. And then I think you'll see that those metrics really do start to shine through, rather than being something kind of off to one side. So build it into strategy, build it into the way you look at risk, build it into the way you think about culture, build it into your considerations of what skills and knowledge you need around the board table, build it into how you measure your performance, that of the company, but also each individual, you know, how people are rewarded, procedures, governance structures, reporting you provide, communications you send out day to day. So the G in ESG is a constituent part, but it's also, for me, the piece that binds it all together. When you think, when you want to operationalize ESG, the governance arrangements that are in place, and you can put in place those different processes, they are the ways that you can operationalize ESG.
So then the idea of creating, you know, an ESG department, for example, or a VP for sustainability, that doesn't work. I mean, that's not really going to work. It's not about a department. It's really about the culture of the organization. It's how you make decisions. It's how you assess your performance. It's how you look at your impact. And that's why one of the terminologies which is used, actually, it's impact investing as well. So it's not really about this. But one of the things we always get from companies when we talk about sustainability is the cost of it. So they say, now you are telling us to do all these things, and that's expense for us. You know, we have to think about, you know, things and invest money and so on. And if our competitors are not doing that, then we will be losing out. So our margins will be lower because of this. I mean, how can you convince companies that, you know, this is not really the right way of assessing that sort of investment in ESG, if you like?
Yeah, it's framing it, I think, in, well, there's two ways. One is, if we keep it in financial terms, it's framing it as opportunity cost, you know, risk to the actual opportunity. There's the actual cost of implementing ESG measures, which, you know, I would argue, if we don't think about this as a bit of regulation or something that we just need to apply, if we think about it as this is just a slightly different way of thinking about our organization, or it's a way of packaging up a lot of the things we do and making sure that we can articulate that properly to stakeholders. So I kind of want to put that to one side a little bit, in terms of, you know, not thinking about it as just a cost in itself. But even if you do kind of think about it as a cost, and maybe that does involve hiring a VP for sustainability, at least in the short term, to lead the initiatives, if that is what organizations decide to do, if that's appropriate to them. Really what it is about is making sure that you know, organizations are aware of what the consequences of not doing it are, rather than anything else. So if you are searching for capital, if you are looking for investment, I think we can say that, you know, if investors are prioritizing companies with clear goals and performance metrics around sustainability and ESG, and as I think we note in the paper, you know, 90% of S&P 500 companies are publishing sustainability reports, but say 26% of them, of the largest companies in the Middle East are, that is a literal opportunity lost. And the other way I would appeal, and maybe this is the romantic in me, and as a governance person, we're always romantic because we're looking to try and articulate the overall value that good governance, for example, can bring to an organization. I think we're seeing a bit more consistency around the view that it's the right thing to do. You know, organizations need to be able to say the impact and understand the impact that they're having on society, on the environment, and understand how they run, because that's kind of the international step change in thinking that perhaps we've had, even if ESG doesn't necessarily resonate around the world yet, or we don't all frame it in the same way or follow the same guidelines. I think organizations and our stakeholders want us to do the right thing. So we should.
Well, and honestly, I think the numbers of the performance of companies during the pandemic reflected that those companies which were really responsible before that and who paid attention to the stakeholders, they really benefited from that, and they were able to survive in a much better and easy way than companies which didn't really pay attention to their stakeholders at all. And they were left alone to face the storm, if you like, in this respect. I think one of the interesting things in our paper is simply our report is it gives you at the end some sort of steps of what companies need to do and what boards of directors have to be leading. Now, as James mentioned, it is really tone at the top, which means it does not start with the management. It starts with the board of directors, because that's where, you know, the strategy of the company is, and that's where the vision of the company and the values and culture is really set. So the first step we mentioned is simply that, as we said at the beginning, ESG is three things. You have environmental factors, you have social, and you have governance. And under each one of them, you have lots of different initiatives and ideas and ways and reporting and different things under each one of them. Just to give you one idea, actually, our index that with S&P has almost 200 variables which cover these elements. And again, it's not really the biggest. You might have even more variables. So I think one of the advice we give for the boards is, if you'd like to be action-oriented, you have to laser focus on some of these elements. So you have to decide on, okay, I cannot take ESG, all of it at once. I have to select what are the things which are important for our company at this stage. It can be something environmental, it can be social, it can be governance, it can be a mix of these things. And you have to have targeted efforts, which means we say, okay, now for us this year, we have 10 factors. These are key factors in the area of ESG, and we have to focus on them. So you don't just leave it like this and say, let's do anything at any place. It has to be a part of a strategy. So I think the idea, James, of laser focusing is quite important, especially if you're just starting your efforts, right? You cannot really focus on everything at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. We often use the term boiling the ocean. That's not what this is about. We're not trying to boil the ocean. We're trying to just focus on, you know, where is the organization and where are its stakeholders going to see the greatest impact. And that's going to be different for different boards, different organizations, really depending on the nature, the size, complexity of the organization and where it operates. But that's a really important point.
Yeah, and then after you do that, you start to integrate these factors in your own strategy, as James mentioned. So it's not like you have a nice sign which says these are our values. No, your strategy must reflect those elements of sustainability that you have chosen as part of your priority for the coming 1 or 2 or 3 years. So you have to have plans on how to deal with them. You have to decide on your targets. You have to decide on who are my stakeholders. You have to have KPIs for this, and the KPIs for the management as well. Are they really committed to these variables or not? So, and then you have to track what's happening. You have to see, how are we doing there? Are we doing well or not? Now, this is what James talked about, which is reporting. So it is not enough to be good. You have to be transparent about it as well. So companies, investors, your stakeholders, and employees. Now, we mentioned a while ago that, you know, you had lots of resignations from US companies and people saying, we don't like the culture in this company. So if the company shares with the stakeholders what they are doing, they gain the respect of employees and the stakeholders. And this actually affects your ability to sustain that sort of effort and go in the long term in that respect. Any comments on this part, James?
No, I think that's a really important summary, Ashraf, Dr. Ashraf. I think the reporting piece, you know, I think in bringing it back to the different frameworks or the different standards, you know, the board and the executive leadership should be taking ownership for, okay, what do we want to report? How do we want to disclose? But increasingly, you know, we will have, and we do already have, great examples that are out there internationally in the market that can be borrowed from. And I think that's a really good starting point for the boards as to, you know, what can we learn from our peers? What can we learn from other industries? And then how do we align this to the way we think about ourselves as an organization, as a culture, and how do we align it to our strategy?
Yeah, and then when you talk about engaging with the stakeholders, it's actually, we talk about ESG matters. What are their expectations from us? What do they have in mind? So how can we make sure that in our strategy, our work, we are really satisfying the needs of our stakeholders as well? So again, this might mean more transparency, more fairness, channels of communication, whatever it is. So the board has to make sure the company has a system by which we are communicating with our stakeholders properly. And then the board, I think one of the key elements, James, which we didn't touch upon today, we still have 5 minutes, is the board composition itself. Now, who should be sitting on the board if you talk about companies like this? What kind of experience or knowledge you look at in boards like this one?
Yeah, I think when we look at we often use the term skills matrix for a board. I tend to prefer the term composition matrix because it's actually more than just skills. It's skills, it's knowledge, it's expertise, it's particular backgrounds, it's certain soft skills, etc. And within that, I think the organizations that do this best, they think about first of all, that's aligned to strategy and can evolve over time as strategy evolves, just as we're talking about ESG aligning to strategy and the way organizations think about it. But it also is bringing in considerations of who those stakeholders are. If we have a strong retail customer base, do we want to bring in somebody who is a specialist in an organization with a large retail customer base that has a fantastic reputation for engaging with them? Do we want to then also look at our different ESG metrics and think about how they might be applied? So if we think that actually, particularly over the next few years, our impact in a certain country, a certain jurisdiction might be quite significant, and particularly as we are reporting that and disclosing that to our stakeholders, we want somebody from that country, from that jurisdiction. Do we want somebody who's able to talk about the environmental impact of water, if that's a big thing for us? So it's really bringing all of those different considerations together, stakeholders and ESG metrics, and then trying to make it so that your board reflects the priorities within that. What we're certainly not saying, by the way, is, of course, create a board of 100 people and have every single potential stakeholder group represented and every single ESG metric. It's about, as all of these things are, it's about prioritizing and trying to get that balance right. But it's a really important point, actually, because we're asking here that boards take the leadership in this, that they have the ownership, that they are overseeing this effectively, that they are overseeing disclosures around it. And they're ultimately the ones that are responsible for all of these different things that we're talking about, or approval of all of these different things that we're talking about to use, like strategy, like risk appetite, etc. But at the same time, you can only do that effectively if you have the right people around the table. And having the right people around the table means understanding these things in the first place. So it's a little bit of an ongoing cycle. It's not a point in time thing, and it's a little bit cyclical, but certainly not something to be overlooked.
And I also would like to share with our audience that in fact, a lot of research was done on gender diversity on boards and how this impact the board performance. And one of the key elements that came out in many research, actually, that was done in different countries and different companies, is simply that women on board, they are much more into the area of sustainability and environment and social than men, for whatever reason. Actually, that's something which was proven by research, which means gender diversity does help you in the area of sustainability. It adds different dimension to the board, but of course the experience of board members as well. I mean, we interact sometimes with boards and nobody on that board knows anything about sustainability. They have no idea what is even that terminology means for them. And you don't really expect that much from a board like this. So as James said at the beginning, I think it's really tone at the top, if you like. We have a couple of minutes in case any of the participants would have any questions. James, I think there is a question on accounting standards and whether we can get this opportunity cost of being responsible, if you like, into accounting. Is there any standard which covers that? Accounting standard covering that?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. But a very good question, and one that perhaps we can follow up on and clarify, align with the our follow-up on this session.
Yeah, but again, what we mentioned, and you mentioned at the beginning, is actually it's long term. I mean, talk about sustainability. It doesn't mean that when you invest in being more responsible, this will give you profits this year or return this year, but then you will be more attractive for investors. You'll be more attractive for large companies to be a part of the supply chain, and so there are, and you will be more responsible employer. You attract the best people in the market. So there are other elements which you cannot really quantify immediately, but that's for the long term, if you like. So it's not really a short-term sort of gain by being responsible, you make more profits. I don't think it really goes like this.
Yeah. I think it also, these things that they're not necessarily an exact science, as we know. I think when it comes to, potential investment or potential lost investment, an organization is probably not going to say that, well, we secured $10 million worth of capital because we have a very clear, solely because or primarily because we report well on ESG matters, or we're clear on our framework. But I think what we can say, based on the practices and the themes that we're seeing in the investment community internationally, is that it is a key consideration. The way you reflect that back on a balance sheet or through your accounting is an interesting one, but nonetheless it's a nuanced thing, and something that is we're increasing our knowledge of and understanding of day to day. We're on a bit of a journey.
Yeah, it's a journey, never a destination. Actually, it never finishes. Lessons to learn, improvements, and so on. So I think our time is up now. The good news is you'll be receiving the report next week, inshallah, once it's ready. You get the link from Nasdaq, and I would like to hear your feedback and topics you'd like us to cover in the future. With Nasdaq, we have a long-term partnership and cooperation, so we'll be happy to respond to whatever you ask us for. Okay, back to the moderator now.
Thank you so much, James and Dr. Ashraf, for the informative program. And to the audience who have been attending the seminar, we've recorded today's presentation and will be circulating this recording to attendees. And as Dr. Ashraf has mentioned earlier, the corporate sustainability white paper will be distributed next week. So do keep an eye out for that as well. With that, I thank everyone for your time, and I wish everyone a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, James. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf.